Imagine if I told you that the most important words ever spoken in human history never made it to you. Think about that for a moment. You grew up hearing about the Last Supper. This image is etched in your memory. Jesus surrounded by 12 apostles, bread broken, wine shared. You know those words. Take and eat, this is my body. Drink from it all of you, for this is my blood. But what if I told you there's so much more? That on that night, in the upper room in Jerusalem, 2,000 years ago, words were spoken, teachings were given, mysteries were revealed, and they were deliberately omitted from the texts that reached you. I'm not talking about unfounded conspiracy theories. I'm talking about historical documentation, ancient manuscripts discovered by archaeologists, texts preserved in forgotten languages and unearthed in distant deserts. I'm talking about scientific evidence that serious researchers have been analyzing for decades, but that remain unknown to most people sitting in pews every Sunday. The question that won't let you rest is why? Why were some words preserved and others not? Why are some Gospels in the Bible and others omitted? And most importantly, what do those lost words reveal about Jesus' true teaching? For centuries, generations of Christians believed they had a complete account of that holy night. But modern textual research, archaeological findings, and linguistic analyses of the oldest manuscripts tell a different story. Stories of selection, editing, human decisions about what to keep or not, and about what really matters. Those missing words are not insignificant details. They touch the core of the deepest questions of human existence. They speak about equality, about the role of women in the early Christian movement, about direct mystical experiences of divinity, about power versus service, about hierarchy versus community. In the next minutes, you'll embark on a historical journey that can completely transform your understanding of this sacred moment. I won't invent anything, I won't speculate without basis. I'll show you what the real manuscripts say, what researchers discovered, what ancient traditions preserved. You'll learn about texts excluded from the Bible, not because they were false, but because they told a story that certain religious leaders preferred you not to know. You'll understand the political and human process behind the formation of the Bible as we know it today. And you'll discover that seeking spiritual truth doesn't need to destroy your faith. On the contrary, it can deepen it in ways you never imagined. But I have to warn you, what you're about to discover may be uncomfortable, may challenge beliefs you've held since childhood, may make you question the authorities you've always considered absolute. And that's exactly what Jesus did. He questioned, challenged, he invited people to think, to investigate, to rethink what they were told. So, take a deep breath, open your mind, and join me in this investigation into the lost words of the Last Supper. Words that may be more alive and relevant today than ever. To understand what was erased, we must first have a deep understanding of what happened that night. And here's something that may surprise you. The Last Supper was not a Christian invention. It was a 1,000-year-old Jewish celebration. Jesus was Jewish. His disciples were Jewish. And that night, on Thursday, the eve of the crucifixion, they did nothing new. They participated in one of the oldest and most sacred rituals of Judaism, Passover or Pesach. Imagine the scene, Jerusalem overflowing with pilgrims. It's estimated that the city's population multiplied by 10 during Passover. Streets crowded, air soaked with incense and the aroma of roasted lambs. Every Jewish family prepared its own celebration of liberation from Egypt, recreating the last meal before the Exodus. The Jewish Passover supper is not an ordinary meal. It's a complex and symbolic ritual. Each food on the table tells a story. Unleavened bread represents the haste of liberation. There was no time to leaven the bread before escaping slavery. Bitter herbs symbolize suffering in Egypt. Wine represents joy, freedom, divine promise. And here's the key detail. During this meal, there are specific moments for teaching. The president of the supper, in this case Jesus, has the task to explain the symbols, tell the story of salvation. Connecting the past to the present is a moment of oral transmission of wisdom, tradition, mystery. Studies of Jewish practices in the 1st century reveal that these celebrations could last hours. It wasn't a quick meal. It was an immersive experience, full of prayers, songs, theological discussions, rabbinic teachings. Participants reclined on couches, a posture symbolizing freedom, while slaves ate standing. Now, when you read the Gospels, you notice something intriguing. They offer surprisingly concise accounts of what must have been hours of experience. Matthew dedicates only 4 verses to Jesus' words about bread and wine. Mark even less. Luke is a bit more extensive, and John is completely different. In the Gospel of John, Jesus doesn't even mention bread and wine in the traditional way. Instead, John dedicates 5 entire chapters, chapters 13 to 17, to Jesus' words that night, 5 chapters. That's about 15% of the entire Gospel of John, dedicated exclusively to what Jesus said and did at the Last Supper. So, we have a historical puzzle. Either Jesus said only those few words recorded in Matthew and Mark, or he said much, much more, and most of it was omitted. Textological analyses and comparative studies strongly suggest the second option. The ancient manuscripts of the Gospels, when juxtaposed, reveal variations. I'm not talking about different translations, I'm talking about the original Greek texts. Small differences in the exact words, in the order of phrases, in details included in one version but not in another. These variations are not errors, they are clues. They are evidence that different early Christian communities preserve different aspects of this sacred event. Academic research on oral tradition in first-century Judaism shows that teachers like Jesus didn't teach just through single statements. They repeated, reformulated, adapted their teachings to different listeners and contexts. The very structure of the Passover celebration invited that. It was a time of extensive teaching, not short declarations, and that's where the story becomes even more fascinating. In the early years after the crucifixion, before any gospel was written, these teachings circulated orally. The first Christian communities, scattered throughout the Roman Empire, shared memories, repeated stories, preserved Jesus' words, and not all these communities kept exactly the same things. When the Gospels finally began to be written, decades after the events, each author made choices. Choices about what to include, what to emphasize, what to omit. These choices were influenced by the needs of their particular communities, by the theological questions they faced, by the challenges their readers faced. So when you realize that the Last Supper was a several-hour celebration, full of deep Jewish symbolism, led by a teacher who regularly taught through long discourses, you start to understand that those few verses from the Gospels can't be the complete story. And this leads us to the inevitable question. What else did Jesus say? What other teachings were given on that holy night? And why did some communities preserve memories that others did not? Before revealing those answers, I have to invite you. This is not just about watching, it's about participating in a collective awakening. If you feel there's a depth in the Christian message that goes beyond what's normally taught, if you're looking for a richer, historically grounded understanding of your faith, subscribe now and hit the bell. Because every video here is built with historical rigor and spiritual respect. We don't make up secrets, we explore the true mysteries that history and archaeology reveal to us. Join this community of truth seekers. Now let's do something few Christians have done. We'll put the 4 accounts of the Last Supper side by side and carefully observe the differences. And be prepared, because what you discover may surprise you. Let's start with Matthew chapter 26, verses 26 to 29. The account is direct and concise. During the meal, Jesus takes the bread, blesses it, breaks it, and distributes it, saying, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then he takes the cup, gives thanks, and says, "Drink from it all, for this is my blood, the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Then he adds that he will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until the day he drinks it new in the kingdom of God. 4 verses in total. Mark chapter 14 verses 22 to 25 is almost identical, with small linguistic variations. The basic words are the same: body, blood, covenant, kingdom. Mark also dedicates only 4 verses. Curiously, scholars believe Mark was written first, and Matthew probably used Mark as a source, which would explain the similarity. But when we get to Luke chapter 22 verses 14 to 20, things start to get interesting. Luke includes details that others don't mention. He records Jesus saying, "I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." This phrase reveals emotions, anticipations, deep desire. Luke also presents a slightly different order. In his version, Jesus mentions the cup, then the bread, then the cup again. Some ancient manuscripts of Luke even present shorter versions, omitting parts of these verses, which raises questions about what exactly was in the original text. And then we get to John, and John changes everything completely. In the Gospel of John, chapters 13 to 17, there is no mention of the traditional words about bread and wine. Nothing about "this is my body" or "this is my blood." Instead, John dedicates a huge space to something totally different. Jesus washing the disciples' feet, and then a vast, deep, mystical discourse that spans 5 entire chapters. Think about the importance of that for a moment. The first 3 Gospels, called synoptic because they share a similar view, focus on the words about bread and wine. John ignores that part completely and focuses on teachings of love, unity, persecution, the Holy Spirit, vine and branches, the nature of truth, prayers for the unity of believers. How to explain this dramatic difference? Scientific analyses suggest several fascinating possibilities. Perhaps John was writing for a community already well familiar with the bread and wine tradition, so he chose to preserve other teachings from that night that weren't widely known. Perhaps he wanted to emphasize more mystical and spiritual aspects instead of ritual elements. Or, and this is the possibility that really interests us here, perhaps John was preserving a different oral tradition, memories of words that were really said that night, but omitted by other evangelists. Studies on the formation of the Gospels reveal that each author had access to different sources. Matthew and Luke probably used Mark, but also had access to another source of Jesus' teachings, which scholars call source Q from the German Quelle, meaning source. John seems to have access to completely independent traditions. What this tells us is that, from the beginning, different Christian communities conserved different memories of that night, and that the Gospel authors made conscious choices about what to include in their limited texts. Papyrus was expensive, parchments had limited length, not everything could be included. But here's the key issue. If we have these variations even in texts accepted in the Bible, what does that say about texts that weren't included? If Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John can present such different accounts of the same night, what other versions, different teachings, different words could have been preserved in Christian communities whose texts didn't make it into the final canon? The answer, as you're about to discover, is many other words, many other teachings. And some of those words were deliberately excluded not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient for the power structures forming in the institutional church. The texts were found, the manuscripts unearthed, and they tell a broader, richer story and in some aspects more challenging than the simplified version that reached us. But before diving into those lost texts, we need to understand something fundamental. How those words were transmitted in the early years of Christianity, before any gospel was written. And that's what we're going to explore now. Here's something that can completely change your perspective. When Jesus died, there was no Christian Bible, no New Testament, no written Gospels. There were only memories, stories, words passed from mouth to mouth. The oldest Gospel, probably Mark, wasn't written until about 40 years after the crucifixion. 40 years, an entire generation of Christians lived, suffered persecutions, and died without ever reading a single word about Jesus. Everything they knew came from oral tradition. And oral tradition in the ancient world wasn't like the broken telephone we know today, where the message distorts with each repetition. Anthropological research on oral tradition cultures shows that those societies developed sophisticated memorization techniques. In first-century Judaism, teachers and students spent years memorizing sacred texts, rabbinic teachings, Torah interpretations. Jesus taught for 3 years. 3 years of discourses, parables, debates, public and private teachings. The Gospels retain only a fraction of that material. John himself admits it at the end of his Gospel. There are many other things that Jesus did. If they were written one by one, I suppose the whole world wouldn't contain the books that would be written. So, what happened to all that unregistered material? It circulated, it was shared, it was preserved in the memories of the first Christian communities. Ancient texts from the Church Fathers, Christian leaders from the first centuries occasionally refer to words of the Lord that don't appear in any canonical gospel. They are called agrapha, literally unwritten things. They are quotes attributed to Jesus preserved outside the Gospels. For example, a famous quote preserved in the Acts of the Apostles: "It is more blessed to give than to receive." Those words are attributed to Jesus, but don't appear in any gospel. Paul knew that oral tradition and shared it. Studies of early Christian communities reveal a surprising diversity of practices and beliefs. There were Jewish Christians who kept the Mosaic Law. There were Gentile Christians who rejected Jewish practices. There were communities that emphasized mystical visions. Others focused on ethics. Some recognized female leadership. Others were more patriarchal. And each of those communities kept the memories of Jesus relevant to their own situations. A community fighting persecution would preserve teachings about suffering and resistance. A community dealing with internal conflicts would focus on words about unity and forgiveness. A community exploring mystical experiences would keep teachings about union with the divine. Now here's where it becomes crucial for our topic. The Last Supper wasn't just about bread and wine, it was Jesus' farewell moment, his last hours with the disciples before his arrest. It's reasonable to assume he would have said much more than a few phrases preserved in the Synoptic Gospels. Some oral traditions suggest Jesus spoke extensively about the community's future. Others retain memories of teachings about women's role. After all, scholars believe women may have been present at the Last Supper, although this is usually minimized in traditional artistic and theological depictions. Linguistic analyses of the Gospels show that some teachings have characteristics of carefully preserved oral tradition. Poetic patterns, parallelisms, mnemonic structures that facilitate memorization. These are signs that the material was orally transmitted before being written. But here's an uncomfortable question. Not all oral traditions were eventually recorded, and of those that were, not all made it into the Bible. There was a process of selection, filtering, deciding what was orthodox and what wasn't. That process didn't happen immediately, it was gradual. Over the first centuries, as the institutional church consolidated, certain versions of events became official, while others were marginalized. Texts that supported the emerging power structure were preserved. Texts that challenged that structure were contested. And here's what's really fascinating. Some of those marginalized texts still survive. They were secretly copied, hidden, buried, and in the 20th century, archaeologists discovered them. They unearthed texts that preserve oral traditions different from those of the canonical Gospels. Texts that contain words attributed to Jesus that never appeared in the Bible. Texts that suggest the Last Supper contained teachings about equality, about direct access to divinity without intermediaries, about women's spiritual authority. These texts were called apocryphal or heretical. But that's the perspective of the winners who write history. From the point of view of the communities that preserved them, they were as sacred and authentic as any canonical gospel. So, here's a question that should trouble you. If important oral traditions were deliberately omitted from the Bible, what else don't you know about what Jesus really taught? And more importantly, are you willing to seek those lost truths, even if they challenge what you've always been taught? If you're with me on this journey, if you feel there's a deeper layer of truth waiting to be discovered, please write in the comments, "I'm seeking the full truth." I want to know how many of us are really ready for this honest investigation, without fear of questioning, without fear of discovering that history is more complex than it seems. Let's create a community of intellectual courage and spiritual curiosity. Now let's talk about one of the most decisive moments in Christianity's history. A moment that forever changed the texts you read and that never reached you. Year 325 AD, almost 3 centuries after the crucifixion. Emperor Constantine, a recent convert to Christianity, summons bishops from across the empire to the city of Nicaea in present-day Turkey. The official goal? Resolve theological controversies, especially regarding Christ's nature. But what really happened there had much broader consequences. To understand the importance of this moment, you need to grasp the context. In the first 3 centuries, Christianity was not a unified religion. It was a diversified and decentralized movement, with dozens of communities practicing variations of the faith. There were Christians who considered Jesus completely human. Others considered him completely divine. Some believed in both at the same time. There were groups that valued direct mystical experiences. Others emphasized doctrine and hierarchy, and each of those groups had their own sacred texts. Gospels telling Jesus' story in slightly different ways, letters from different leaders, apocalypses, theological treatises, miracle accounts, teachings preserved by specific communities. But now Christianity was becoming the empire's religion, and empires need uniformity. They need a set of beliefs everyone must accept. They need orthodoxy. The Council of Nicaea didn't primarily deal with which books should be in the Bible. That official canonization process took longer, but it was the beginning of standardization. It was the moment when political power merged with religious power to decide. This is the correct version of Christianity. Everything else is heresy. Historical documentation from that period reveals heated debates. Bishops disagreed vehemently about divine nature, reliable texts, acceptable practices. But in the end, one version prevailed, not necessarily because it was truer, but because it had more political support. And here's what that meant in practice. Texts supporting the winning version were copied, preserved, distributed. Texts contradicting it were rejected, not all immediately but gradually. Over the centuries they disappeared, stopped being copied, were actively destroyed, entire libraries burned. Criteria were established to decide which texts were authentic and which weren't. A text was considered reliable if attributed to a direct apostle, if widely used in important communities, if it didn't contradict standardized doctrine. Note that none of these criteria relate to objective historical truth. They are criteria of authority and conformity. Historical research from that period shows that many excluded texts were known and respected by Christian communities for centuries. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, may have been written as early as the canonical Gospels, perhaps even in the 1st century, but was excluded. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene preserves teachings presenting women as spiritual leaders and was excluded. Why? Some reasons were genuinely theological. Some texts contained ideas Christian leaders considered problematic, but some reasons were political and social. Texts suggesting female spiritual authority threatened emerging patriarchal structures. Texts emphasizing direct mystical experience threatened the authority of bishops and priests as indispensable intermediaries. Political influence was significant. Constantine wasn't a theologian, he was an emperor concerned with unity and control. He needed Christianity to be a unifying force in his empire, not a source of division. So he supported standardization even if it meant silencing dissenting voices. Now it's important to be fair. There were genuine reasons for some level of standardization. With so many different versions of Christianity circulating, some did contain problematic or distorted ideas. There were texts clearly invented late, with no real connection to Jesus' original teachings. The canonization process wasn't entirely arbitrary or malicious. But, and this is significant, the process also wasn't divine or infallible. It was deeply human. It included politics, power, cultural preferences, knowledge limitations. Fallible people made decisions about which texts to keep and which to eliminate, and some of those decisions had more to do with control than with truth. Contemporary scientific perspectives recognize this complexity. The Bible's formation was necessary to preserve the central tradition, but it also resulted in loss. Loss of diversity, loss of alternative voices, loss of teachings that could have enriched the Christian faith. And here's where we return to the Last Supper. If entire texts valued by early Christian communities were excluded from the Bible, what does that say about teaching passages in those texts? What does it say about words attributed to Jesus that Holy Night preserved in non-canonical Gospels? The inevitable answer is, those words were silenced not because they were false, but because they didn't fit the constructed narrative. They were erased not by history, but by deliberate human choice. And in the following centuries, the memory of those texts almost completely vanished. Generations of Christians grew up without knowing other versions of Jesus' teachings existed until the 20th century, until archaeological discoveries began to reveal the hidden texts buried in clay jars in distant deserts, manuscripts preserved in ancient languages, entire libraries of early Christian texts that survived because someone hid them from destruction long ago. Those texts are now available, translated, researched, and they tell a different story, the broader story of the Last Supper and Jesus' teachings. It's to those texts that we now turn our attention. Prepare yourself, because what you're about to discover will dramatically expand your understanding of what Jesus might really have said that crucial night. The word apocryphal has weight. For many, it sounds false or heretical, but scientifically, apocryphal simply means hidden or secret. They were texts circulating among early Christian communities, but not included in the Bible's official canon. And here's what few know. Some of those texts are as ancient as the canonical Gospels. They were written in the same regions, by the same communities, with the same care and reverence. The only real difference is they lost the political battle of canonization. Let's examine some of those texts and what they reveal about words that might have been said at the Last Supper. Let's start with the Gospel of Thomas. Discovered in Egypt in 1945 as part of the Nag Hammadi library, this text contains 114 statements attributed to Jesus. It's not a narrative like the canonical Gospels, it's a collection of teachings. Scholars debate its dating, but some argue it preserves traditions as ancient as any canonical Gospel. What's fascinating in Thomas is its focus on inner knowledge and direct mystical experience. One of the most famous statements in it, "The kingdom is inside you and outside you. When you know yourselves, then you will be known and understand that you are children of the living Father." This kind of teaching on inner discovery, direct access to divinity without intermediaries, is exactly the type of message shared in an intimate moment like the Last Supper. In fact, comparative studies show parallels between some Thomas statements and elements of John's farewell discourse. Another important text is the Gospel of Philip, also discovered in Nag Hammadi. Philip contains reflections on sacraments, including the Eucharist. It presents deep and symbolic interpretations of the meaning of bread and wine, suggesting these elements represent more than just physical body and blood, but mystical union with the divine. Philip preserves the tradition of interpreting the Last Supper as a moment of initiation into deep spiritual mysteries. A passage suggests that those who truly participate in communion transcend death not physically but spiritually. This is a mystical interpretation that goes beyond the common literal understanding. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene is particularly significant when thinking about the Last Supper. Although it doesn't specifically describe the supper, this text preserves Jesus' teachings on spiritual vision and the nature of reality. And crucially, it presents Mary Magdalene as recipient of special teachings, which she shares with other disciples. See why this is important. If Mary received special teachings from Jesus, and if as many scholars now believe women were present at the Last Supper, then words about their role about spiritual equality were said that night and preserved in traditions associated with female disciples, not just the 12 men. These traditions were systematically minimized or eliminated as Christianity became more patriarchal. The Gnostic texts found in Nag Hammadi present a view of early Christianity very different from later Orthodoxy. In these texts, Jesus is presented as teacher of secret wisdom, revealing mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. The Last Supper in this context would be the moment of revealing mysteries, not just establishing a ritual. It's important to emphasize that these texts are not uniformly reliable as history. Some contain ideas developed well after Jesus' time. Some mixed Christian teachings with Greek philosophies or pagan mystical practices. Serious scientific work involves separating layers of tradition, distinguishing early material from later developments. But here's the key point. Even acknowledging these complexities, these texts retain the memory that early Christianity was much more diversified than we imagine, and that Jesus' teachings, including possible ones from the Last Supper, were transmitted in many traditions that ended up suppressed. Comparative textual analyses reveal that certain themes appear consistently in apocryphal texts. Emphasis on inner knowledge, the importance of direct mystical experience, questioning external religious hierarchies, including women in spiritual leadership roles. These themes also appear more subtly in the canonical Gospels, especially in John. This suggests these ideas were not late inventions of heretical groups, but part of Christianity from the beginning and the Last Supper. As the culminating moment of Jesus' ministry, his last hours with the disciples would be the natural context for teachings on these deep topics. Imagine, Jesus knows he's going to die. He shares his last words with those he loves. Would this be the moment for simple ritual formulas, or for transmitting deep wisdom, spiritually preparing his followers for what was coming, revealing mysteries he kept hidden? Human and spiritual logic suggests the second option. And the apocryphal texts keep the memory that yes, deeper things were said. Studies of the practices of communities that preserved these texts reveal they performed ritual meals where esoteric teachings were shared. These practices date back to their own traditions of the Last Supper. For these communities, the supper wasn't just about eating bread and drinking wine. It was about spiritual awakening, about gnosis, about direct knowledge of divinity. Established churches called this heresy, and there were theological reasons for their concerns. Some Gnostic interpretations did stray significantly from Jesus' Judaism and early Christianity. But by totally rejecting these traditions, they also lost authentic elements they held. The scientific value of these texts cannot be underestimated. They are windows to the diversity of early Christianity. They show there wasn't a single version of what Jesus taught. Different communities, all claiming connection to original teachings, preserved different memories. And when you realize that, when you understand that Christianity as we know it is the result of selection, not totality, the inevitable question arises. What was lost in the process? Specifically, which Last Supper words about spiritual equality, direct access to divinity, women's role, mystical nature of union with Christ were deliberately excluded because they threatened emerging power structures? The apocryphal texts don't give definitive answers, but they give clues, fragments, echoes of broader traditions that existed. And those clues lead us to the next part of our investigation. Archaeological discoveries that brought these lost texts back to light. Because without 20th century archaeology, those silenced voices would have remained lost forever. December 1945. An Egyptian peasant named Muhammad Ali al-Saman digs for fertilizer near the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt. His shovel hits something hard. He discovers a large clay jar buried in the sand. He breaks the vessel and finds 13 papyrus codices, ancient books, perfectly preserved by the desert's dry climate. What Muhammad found was nothing less than an entire library of early Christian texts. 52 different texts, many of them gospels and teachings the world hadn't seen for over 500 years. This discovery, known as the Nag Hammadi Library, completely changed our understanding of early Christianity. Suddenly, texts we knew only from hostile references by Orthodox leaders were available for direct reading. We could finally hear the voices that had been silenced. Academic analyses dated these codices from the 4th century AD. Though the texts they contain are probably translations or copies of much older originals, some possibly from the 1st or 2nd century. But why were these texts buried? The most accepted theory is that monks from a nearby monastery hid them when orders from Christian authorities came to destroy heretical texts. Instead of burning them, someone bravely preserved them, burying them in the desert, perhaps waiting for a future time when they could be read again. This wasn't the only significant archaeological discovery. In 1947, Bedouin shepherds discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls in caves near Qumran. Although these manuscripts are predominantly Jewish texts, not Christian, they revolutionized our understanding of the Jewish context in which Jesus lived and taught. The Dead Sea Scrolls revealed practices of a Jewish community conducting ritual communal meals of deep spiritual meaning. These practices provide context for understanding the Last Supper, not as something entirely new, but as part of Jewish traditions of sacred meals that Jesus knew and participated in. Research on these discoveries shows that 1st century Judaism was much more diversified than we imagined. There were countless sects, Torah interpretations, ritual practices. Jesus moved in that world of religious diversity, and his teachings were part of those complex conversations. Other ancient papyri, discovered during the 20th century, contain fragments of Christian texts. Some retain slightly different versions of passages we know from the canonical Gospels. These textual variations show that even the texts eventually included in the Bible existed in many versions in the 1st centuries. What does this mean for our understanding of the Last Supper? It means the account wasn't transmitted in a single, unaltered way. From the beginning, different communities remembered and recorded the event in slightly different ways. Discoveries in Oxyrhynchus, Egypt, revealed thousands of papyri fragments, including some of the oldest known Christian texts. Among them, fragments of non-canonical Gospels and Jesus statements that don't appear in the Bible. Some of these fragments date from the 2nd century or even late 1st. Paleographic analyses, study of ancient writing, and carbon dating tests provide reliable dating for these manuscripts. We're not talking about medieval forgeries. These are genuinely ancient documents preserving early Christian traditions. Codicological research, analysis of the physical construction of ancient books, reveals these texts were valued. They were carefully copied, preserved in conditions that would prolong their life, treated as sacred scriptures by the communities that owned them. A fascinating aspect of these discoveries is that they were often found in deserts, caves, ancient garbage dumps, remote places. Why? Because once considered heretical, those who valued them had few options: destroy them as ordered or hide them. Many chose to hide. And thanks to that courage and the dry climate that preserved papyri that would normally have deteriorated, we have access to voices that were supposed to be silenced forever. Now it's crucial to keep a scientific perspective. The fact that these texts are ancient doesn't make them automatically reliable as historical record. Texts must be critically evaluated regardless of when written. Antiquity isn't equal to authenticity. But, and this is important, these texts unequivocally show that early Christianity was much more diversified than official narratives suggest, and that this diversity included different memories and interpretations of the Last Supper. Some communities emphasize the ritual aspect of bread and wine as sacrament. Others emphasize the communal aspect, sharing a meal as symbol of equality. Still others emphasize the mystical aspect of communion as spiritual union with the divine. All these interpretations coexisted in the 1st centuries. All claimed connection to Jesus' original teachings. And archaeology proved such different traditions really existed, not inventions of modern historians. What these discoveries teach us is humility. Humility to recognize we don't have the full picture, that there are gaps in our knowledge, that words were lost, and they teach possibility. The possibility that Jesus' deep teachings, including Last Supper words, survived in fragments, waiting to be rediscovered, reinterpreted, reintegrated into spiritual understanding. So, armed with this archaeological knowledge, with these rediscovered texts, we can now ask the central question: what words might Jesus have uttered that night that didn't reach us through the canonical Gospels? Now we reach the core of our investigation. Based on everything we've examined, historical context, variations in the Gospels, oral traditions, apocryphal texts, archaeological discoveries, we can academically reconstruct what kinds of teachings Jesus may have transmitted at the Last Supper that weren't preserved in the canonical accounts. Let's be clear from the start. We can't know for sure. We have no recordings, no living witnesses. What we have are clues, context, fragments of alternative traditions, but those clues are enough to create conscious, academically responsible reconstructions. First, consider the Jewish cultural context. The Jewish Passover supper included specific moments for teaching. The leader answered questions, explained symbols, told the tradition story. If Jesus followed that pattern, and everything indicates he did, then he would have spoken at length about meanings, about history, about the future. Analyses of first-century Jewish liturgical practices suggest discussions about liberation were central. Passover celebrated liberation from slavery in Egypt. Jesus, knowing he would soon die, almost certainly spoke of a new type of liberation, spiritual, not just political. Apocryphal texts preserve memories of Jesus speaking of liberation from thought patterns, fears, material attachments. These teachings fit perfectly in the Last Supper context. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. These words in John suggest a theme probably explored much more deeply. Second, consider women's presence. Recent studies of early Christianity make a compelling case that women were integral to Jesus' movement. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna, Mary, and Martha, all mentioned in canonical Gospels as close followers. The absence of women in traditional Last Supper depictions says more about later biases than historical reality. If women were present, and evidence suggests they were, then words about their role, about spiritual equality, about leadership were spoken. The Gospel of Mary preserves a tradition where Peter questions why Jesus would reveal special teachings to a woman. The other disciples' response is essentially, if the Master considered her worthy, who are we to reject her? This kind of discussion could well have roots in the Last Supper. Third, consider teachings on authority and service. John records Jesus washing the disciples' feet at the supper, a radical act of humility and hierarchy inversion. It's reasonable to assume this act was accompanied by extensive teachings on servant leadership versus dominant leadership. Texts emphasizing spiritual equality, rejection of honorific titles, criticism of religious hierarchical structures likely reflect themes Jesus addressed that night. You will not be like the nation's leaders who dominate the people. Among you it will be different. Variations of these words appear in many texts. Fourth, consider mystical teachings on union with the divine. The long discourse in John about vine and branches is clearly mystical. Remain in me and I in you. This kind of language of intimate union with Christ appears in Christian mystical texts for centuries. Traditions preserved in texts like the Gospel of Philip speak of the Eucharist as means of mystical union, not just memorial. Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in him. These words from John 6, though not specifically from the Last Supper, reflect a theme probably deepened during the supper. Fifth, consider teachings on the nature of God's kingdom. Jesus spoke continuously about the kingdom during his ministry. At the Last Supper, knowing he wouldn't be physically present anymore, he would explain how the kingdom would continue without him. Some traditions preserved in non-canonical texts speak of the kingdom as internal reality, not external. The kingdom doesn't come with visible signs. No one will say here it is or there it is because God's kingdom is within you. These words from Luke 17 suggest a teaching probably developed in the Last Supper's intimacy. Sixth, consider teachings on suffering and transformation. Jesus knew he would suffer torture and death, but also taught that suffering can be transformative. Words about finding meaning in pain, not being defeated by evil, love transcending even death, almost certainly were part of that night. Analyses of early Christian literature on martyrdom show first martyrs face death with extraordinary courage, often quoting Jesus' teachings that don't appear in canonical Gospels. Where did those traditions come from? Perhaps from teachings orally transmitted from the Last Supper. Seventh, consider teachings on community and unity. Jesus' prayer in John 17, that all may be one, as you, Father, in me and I in you, is about deep unity, not just organizational. This theme of mystical unity was probably extensively explored. Texts emphasizing communities without rigid hierarchy, where the Spirit directly guides each person, may preserve memories of Jesus' vision for his movement's future. A community based on love and equality, not power and control. Eighth, consider teachings on discernment and inner wisdom. Jesus often spoke in parables, inviting listeners to think deeply, discover hidden meanings. At the Last Supper, with his closest disciples, he could share interpretation keys, deeper understanding. Gnostic traditions keep emphasis on inner knowledge, personal enlightenment. Though elements of these traditions are later developments, the central idea that each person can have direct access to divine truth is consistent with Jesus' teachings on the Spirit that will guide into all truth. Scholars' perspectives on historical reconstruction emphasize caution. We can't simply accept everything in apocryphal texts as Jesus' authentic words, but we can consider these texts retain themes, echoes, thought directions probably rooted in original teachings. What emerges when we gather all these clues is a picture of the Last Supper much richer, deeper, more complex than concise canonical accounts suggest. A night of hours of teaching, exploration of spiritual mysteries, preparation for the future, transmission of fundamental wisdom. Words about equality that threatened hierarchy. Words about direct experience of divinity that threatened religious intermediaries. Words about inclusion that threatened exclusivity. Words about radical love that threatened structures based on fear and control. These are words that could have been erased, not by God, but by people, not for lack of authenticity, but for excess challenge to the status quo. Before we continue exploring the deep implications of these discoveries, I want to create a moment of global connection. Where are you watching from right now? Write your city and country in the comments. Let's show that this search for deeper spiritual truth has no boundaries. That in every corner of the world people are rediscovering lost dimensions of Jesus' teachings. Together, we participate in an awakening that transcends denominations, cultures, continents. Now we need to look closer at what was preserved, specifically the extensive discourse in John chapters 13 to 17. Because here, in the middle of the canonical Bible, we have evidence that Jesus said much more at the Last Supper than the Synoptic Gospels record. John 13 begins with Jesus washing the disciples' feet. It's a profoundly symbolic act. Washing feet was slave work. Jesus, the Master, assumes the role of the humblest servant, and then explains, "If I, the Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet." It's a teaching on power turned upside down. In a world where leadership meant domination, Jesus presents leadership as service. And note, this isn't a quick statement. John dedicates an entire chapter to this episode and associated teachings. John 14 continues with words about not letting your heart be troubled, about preparing a place in the Father's mansions, about Jesus being the way, the truth, and the life. And then comes the central promise, "I will not leave you orphans, I will come to you. In that day you will know that I am in my Father, and you in me, and I in you." This language is mystical. Not about Jesus' physical return, but constant spiritual presence. Union where boundaries between Jesus, the Father, and believers dissolve. This kind of teaching on mystical union is exactly what appears in non-canonical texts called heretical. John 15 presents the metaphor of vine and branches. "I am the vine, you are the branches. He who remains in me, and I in him, bears much fruit." Again, language of intimate unity, mutual dependence, shared life. And then comes one of the clearest and repeated commandments. "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you." Jesus repeats this several times in his discourse. Love not as feeling but as sacrificial action. Love that defines the Christian community. John 16 continues with teachings on the Holy Spirit, the Paraclete, the Comforter. Jesus promises this Spirit will guide into all truth, reveal things the disciples can't bear now. It's a promise of ongoing revelation, not immutable doctrine. And then in John 17 we have what is called Jesus' high priestly prayer. Prayer for unity. Not organizational unity, but mystical. That they all may be one, as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they also may be one in us. Now here's the key question. Why did John preserve all this while Matthew, Mark, and Luke didn't? Why 5 entire chapters of teachings that don't appear in other Gospels? Scholars offer different theories. Some suggest John wrote for a community emphasizing mystical experience and deep theological reflection. Others suggest John had access to oral traditions preserved by different disciple circles. A fascinating possibility is that John deliberately chose to record Last Supper aspects lost or minimized. By the late 1st century, when John was probably written, Christianity was already institutionalizing. Perhaps John wanted to preserve more mystical, intimate, radical dimensions of Jesus' teachings, overshadowed by emerging hierarchical structures. Textological analyses of John's Gospel reveal editing layers. The text was revised, but the farewell discourse core is consistent in all ancient manuscripts. This means these words were valued, carefully preserved, considered authentic by John's communities. Comparisons with non-canonical texts show remarkable parallels. Themes of mystical union, love, sacrifice, inner knowledge, Spirit's presence, appear in both John and texts like Thomas and Philip. This suggests they weren't inventions of heretical groups, but authentic themes of Jesus' teachings, which some texts preserved better than others. What John shows us is that, even within the approved canon, there's evidence the Last Supper was much more than a brief ritual. It was deep spiritual experience, transmission of essential wisdom, moment of extreme intimacy between master and disciples. And if John could dedicate 5 chapters to Last Supper words other evangelists didn't mention, what does that tell us about what even John might have omitted? What else was said that night that no text preserved? The honest answer is, we don't know completely. But we know enough to conclude the lost words were about topics that remain deeply relevant today. Equality, direct access to the divine, inner transformation, radical love, authentic community. So, what does it mean for your faith to discover gaps in the records, words lost, traditions silenced, teachings marginalized? For some, this can be deeply disturbing. And if the Bible doesn't contain everything, if human and political processes influenced what was preserved, how can we trust anything? This is an important and understandable reaction. But there's another way to see it. A way that can actually deepen, not diminish, spiritual experience. First, recognizing humanity in the preservation process doesn't need to eliminate divinity. Different Christian traditions have different theologies about Scripture. Catholic tradition has always recognized the role of church tradition alongside Scripture. Orthodox tradition emphasizes church fathers and ecumenical councils. Protestant traditions emphasize sola scriptura. But even in those traditions, there's recognition that understanding develops through spirit-guided interpretation. What discoveries of lost texts do is invite theological humility. Humility to acknowledge no tradition has complete monopoly on truth. That God might speak through many voices, many communities, many traditions. Second, existence of lost words doesn't mean preserved words are less valuable. The core of the Christian message, love, sacrifice, hope, redemption, transformation, is clearly present in canonical texts. No one needs apocryphal gospels to understand Jesus taught radical love and justice for the marginalized. What additional texts do is enrich, add depth layers, reveal dimensions that might have been minimized. They invite us to ask, what if there's more? And that question can be spiritually invigorating. Third, discovering diversity in early Christianity can be liberating. Many Christians struggle with aspects of their traditions that seem inconsistent with Jesus' character portrayed in the Gospels. Rigid hierarchies, women's exclusion, dogmatism punishing questioning, power structures seeming to contradict Jesus' teaching on service. Knowing those structures weren't inevitable, that there were other paths in early Christianity, that other interpretations were valid before being suppressed, can give permission to question, to seek faith expressions more aligned with the gospel core. Perspectives from different Christian traditions on these topics vary considerably. The Catholic Church holds its tradition and magisterium maintain authentic interpretation. Orthodox churches emphasize liturgical and conciliar continuity. Protestants emphasize return to scriptures, though recognizing interpretation always occurs in community context. But all these traditions, when sincere, acknowledge historical development. Doctrines non-existent in the first century became central later. Practices changed, understandings evolved. This isn't necessarily betrayal of original faith. It can be organic development led by the Spirit. The challenge is discerning what's legitimate development and what's deviation. What's increase in understanding and what's distortion by human interests. There's no easy answer, but the question itself is important. And discovering words were lost forces us to face that issue with renewed seriousness. Fourth, there's the question of spiritual authority. If sacred texts were chosen by human processes, where's final authority? For some in the institutional church, for others in canonical scriptures, for others still in personal experience of divinity. What study of lost texts suggests is perhaps authority shouldn't rest in any single external place, but in combination of tradition, scripture, reason, and experience. What some theologians call the Wesleyan quadrilateral. No element is enough alone. All balance each other. It's a more humble, open, less dogmatic approach, and ironically may be closer to Jesus' spirit, who constantly challenged established religious authorities and invited people to think for themselves. Fifth, there's the practical question. How does this affect everyday spiritual life? If words about equality, direct mystical experience, women's inclusion were minimized, what do we do with that knowledge? The answer isn't rejecting established Christian traditions, but questioning aspects that seem inconsistent with Jesus' teaching core. The question is, does this practice or belief reflect radical love, humble service, inclusion of the marginalized? If not, perhaps it's time to reevaluate. Sixth, there's spiritual freedom in the search. Jesus said, "You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." Seeking truth even when uncomfortable, even when it questions what we've always believed, is an act of faith, not unbelief. The difference between faith and historical knowledge is important here. Faith is trust, commitment, openness to the transcendent. Historical knowledge is about what we can verify through evidence. These two don't need to conflict. Mature faith can incorporate historical honesty without losing fundamental trust in God's goodness and love. Seventh, these discoveries can enrich spiritual experience. Learning about mystical traditions emphasizing direct union with the divine can open new dimensions of prayer and meditation. Knowing women were leaders in early Christianity can free half the church to fully exercise gifts. Understanding community was more important than hierarchy can transform how we form church today. Eighth, there's invitation to respectful questioning. Respect for tradition, for canonical texts, for communities that preserved faith over centuries, but also courageous questioning. Did we lose something essential? Did emphases shift in a way that betrayed original intent? This balance between respect and questioning is hard, but necessary for living faith, not petrified. Finally, there's how these discoveries affect interfaith dialogue. If Christianity is more diversified than we thought, if many interpretations were valid at the beginning, then perhaps we can be more humble in claims of absolute truth, more open to learning from other traditions, more inclined to recognize God can work through many paths. This isn't relativism. Belief all truth is equal. It's epistemological humility, recognizing our knowledge limitations and openness to correction. The implications of these discoveries are thus profound. They invite more mature faith, more questioning, more humble, more open. Faith that doesn't fear truth, because it trusts ultimate truth is love. And love has nothing to fear from honest investigation. But here's what's really noteworthy. Despite all variations in texts, despite all words that might have been lost, despite all human and imperfect preservation processes, the central message endured. No matter which gospel you read, canonical or non, certain themes are inevitably consistent. First, love. Radical, self-denying, transformative love. Love one another as I have loved you. It's not an optional suggestion in any early Christian text. It's the central commandment, community definition, authenticity sign. Every text preserving Last Supper words, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, even passages in non-canonical, emphasizes love. It may be expressed differently, but it's central. Second, sacrifice. Jesus gives himself for others. It's the deep meaning of bread and wine, broken body, shed blood. It's about giving oneself, putting others' needs before own, about love going to death. This theme arises consistently, not invention of specific tradition. It's message core. Third, service. Jesus washes feet, assumes servant role, teaches the greatest among you will be your servant. This completely inverts worldly notions of greatness and power. And here's what's noteworthy. Even texts excluded from the Bible keep this theme. Despite emphasis on knowledge, Gnostic texts still emphasize humility. Texts promoting female leadership do so based on service model, not domination. The core remains intact. Fourth, memory. Do this in remembrance of me. The Last Supper is about remembering not just historical facts, but Jesus' constant presence through community sharing bread and wine. Traditions differ in Eucharist interpretation. Catholics believe in real transubstantiation, Protestants in symbolic remembrance, Orthodox in mystery transcending rational explanation, but all agree. It's about remembering Jesus, making present his sacrifice, renewing commitment to his way. Fifth, communion. The word communion means unity, sharing, deep connection. The Last Supper creates community, not individual act, but corporate. Preserved and excluded texts agree on this. Christianity is about relationship with God, with others, with creation. Isolation is contrary to the gospel. Communion is essential. Sixth, transformation. Participating in the supper changes you. Not just remember Jesus, but transform to his likeness. I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. Paul's words reflect experience the supper represents. Mystical traditions emphasize this clearly. Sacramental traditions expressed through liturgy. Evangelical traditions speak of new birth. Language differs, but reality is consistent. Encounter with Christ in the supper is transformative. Seventh, hope. I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in God's kingdom. The supper points to future, not just past, death memorial or present, current communion, but also future, messianic feast, kingdom fully realized, restoration of all things. This eschatological hope permeates early Christian texts. It's about trusting history has direction, evil won't have last word, redemption is certain. Comparative textual analyses show these core themes appear even in texts disagreeing on details. It's as if, no matter how diverse communities became in specific interpretations, they couldn't escape the core of what Jesus taught and embodied. And this should give us confidence. Not arrogant certainty we know everything, but humble confidence that, despite imperfect processes, despite lost words, despite human manipulation, fundamental truth survived, love message survived, service model survived, communion call survived, transformation promise endured, redemption hope endured. Perhaps this itself is evidence of something divine at work, that despite all human attempts to control, distort, manipulate the message, core still shines, like light that can't be extinguished, like truth that can't be completely suppressed. Mystical traditions have spoken for centuries about how spiritual truth transcends words, that direct encounter with divine transcends texts, that personal experience of God's transformative love is more fundamental than any doctrine. Perhaps that's what the Last Supper represents. Not set of words to remember, but experience to live. Not formulas to repeat, but reality to embody. The kingdom of God is within you. If this is true, and Jesus taught it is, then most important spiritual search isn't discovering all words said that night, but experiencing reality those words pointed to. Communion with divine, union with Christ, transformation into love, participation in the kingdom. These aren't doctrines to defend, but realities to experience. And perhaps that's what Jesus wanted after all. Not imitators remembering words perfectly, but disciples genuinely living the way. Not orthodoxy guardians, but bearers of transformative love. This message no historical suppression could eliminate. So we come to the end of this journey. A journey through centuries of history, through ancient manuscripts, selection and suppression processes, archaeological rediscoveries, to this present moment where you and I are connected through this message. What did we discover? That history is more complex than taught, that words were lost, traditions silenced, teachings marginalized. But we also discovered central message survived: love, sacrifice, service, communion, transformation, hope. We discovered seeking truth isn't unbelief act, but deep belief. That questioning honors reasoning capacity God gave us. That honest history study respects human experience complexities. And perhaps most important, we discovered you don't need to fear. Fear that discovering historical truth destroys faith. Fear that recognizing human processes in Bible formation eliminates divinity. Fear that admitting knowledge gaps means losing foundation. Mature faith doesn't fear truth, because mature faith isn't about having all right answers. It's about trust in God's fundamental goodness, commitment to love path, openness to Spirit continuing to guide into truth. Words erased from Bible about equality, direct divinity experience, inclusion, hierarchy questioning didn't completely disappear. They echo through centuries in reform movements, mystical traditions, communities insisting on Jesus model over power model. And those words are available to you now. Not in sense of having exact text Jesus spoke, it may be lost forever. But in sense of spirit, direction, core values that can be recovered. You can choose community over hierarchy, service over domination, inclusion over exclusion, direct spiritual experience over intermediary dependence. You can choose love over dogma. These choices honor what Jesus taught that final night with disciples. They honor not just preserved words, but spirit behind all words, preserved and lost. Recognizing historical complexity doesn't need to lead to cynicism. It can lead to humility. Humility is deep spiritual virtue. Recognizing knowledge limitations, open to learning, willing to correct, able to change mind faced with evidence. And humility opens path to richer spiritual experience. Because when you don't defend rigid doctrine, don't protect absolute certainties, don't fear questioning, you're free to encounter God in new, deep, transformative ways. The Last Supper isn't just historical event 2,000 years ago. It's ongoing reality. Every time communities gather to share bread and wine, every time people commit to love and service path, every time someone experiences mystical union with divine, the Last Supper happens again. And words, preserved or lost, become less important than reality they indicate. Reality of love transcending death, community overcoming division, hope surviving despair, transformation making new creation possible. It's a message no historical suppression could eliminate, no political process could completely distort, no institutional manipulation could completely destroy. Because truth has its own power, love has its own power. And those powers are stronger than any human attempt to control them. So, what do you do with this knowledge? With awareness, words were lost, but essential message survived. With understanding, faith can be intellectually honest and spiritually deep. You can live it. With authenticity, courage, commitment to love overcoming differences, dedication to service uplifting marginalized, openness to spirit leading wherever it leads, and join the seekers community. Not just people accepting ready answers, but asking hard questions. Not just blind tradition followers, but participants in living tradition that continues evolving. This is the true Last Supper legacy. Not fixed set of words to repeat, but living spirit to embody. Not doctrine to defend, but love to experience. And in that sense, Jesus' most important Last Supper words aren't written in any text, canonical or not. They are words he writes in every person's heart who chooses to follow his path. Words of unconditional love, radical acceptance, impossible forgiveness, unshakable hope, miraculous transformation. No one can erase those words because they don't exist in ancient papyri or surviving codices. They exist in transformed lives, loving communities, justice acts, communion moments. And those words are being written now, in you, through your response to this call for deeper, questioning, courageous, loving faith. The Last Supper continues. Words are still spoken, not by 2,000-year voice, but by spirit still speaking, guiding, transforming. And you're invited to participate, not as ancient history observer, but as active participant in ongoing spiritual reality. This is the awakening you're called to. An awakening to complexity, honesty, humility, love, transformation. If this journey touched something within you, if you felt these historical revelations connect to your spiritual search, don't let the moment pass. Subscribe to the channel now.